welcome. This is the 15th year of Nonfiction Dialogues. First one on Zoom. Maggie is our guinea pig. I am your guinea pig. And here to introduce Maggie is our wonderful nonfiction student, Catherine McNulty.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Nonfiction Dialogues. As you know, Liz is going to be interviewing Maggie Nelson tonight. First, a few things before we begin. I want to make everyone aware that this talk is being recorded. And second, one of the most beloved parts of the Nonfiction Dialogues is the Q&A at the end. We're asking that everybody direct the questions to me privately in the chat, and I'll be asking them on your behalf, crediting you, of course, so that everything can run quickly and smoothly and we can get to as many questions as possible. So the last time Maggie Nelson visited Columbia, I watched her speak on a screen in a classroom far from where the talk was actually happening. There were so many people who turned up to see her. I didn't even get into the primary overflow room. I was in the secondary overflow room. And now it's 3.5 years later, and I still don't get to be in the same room as Maggie Nelson. Though I do have the honor of introducing her.
Yeah.
And I can personally attest that watching her through a screen does nothing to diminish Maggie Nelson's intelligence or insight, which is why we're all here tonight, why the crowd has not diminished in those 3.5 years to see her speak. We all want to peek inside of Maggie Nelson's head. I have to wonder, with this crowd, does she even really need an introduction? But for those of you who aren't familiar, over the course of 9 books, Maggie Nelson's incisive, restless mind has excavated and inhabited the spaces between poetry and prose, between memoir and theory, encompassing feminism, queerness, art, sexual violence, philosophy, aesthetic theory, the history of the avant-garde, the color blue, and the New York School poets. She dove deeply and personally into violence against women and family trauma in her books Jane and The Red Parts, and then examined the cultural and artistic tendency towards violence and its representations in her 2011 book, The Art of Cruelty. In 2015, she published The Argonauts, a hybrid work that our own beloved professor Hilton Alls summed up as, quote, a book about becoming, both mentally and physically, about what it takes to shape a self in all its completeness and disarray. End quote. The Argonauts was a New York Times notable book, and it won the 2015 National Book Critics Circle Award. Her eagerly anticipated forthcoming book, a work of cultural criticism titled On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, is set to be published in 2021, with a book of essays following in 2022. Over the course of her career, Maggie Nelson has been recognized with 2 Creative Capital Fellowships, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and in 2016, she became a MacArthur Fellow. Beyond these impressive honors is the work itself, the work of a mind which, according to poet and cultural critic Wayne Kestenbaum, possesses a procedural rigor and a certain hungry, logorrheic patience. It is with this tenacity and poetic nimbleness that Maggie Nelson writes so expansively and deftly on the page, jumping between identity, grief, pain, pleasure, and the body, all while doing a graceful and precise pas de deux with thinkers as far-ranging as Wittgenstein and Christina Crosby. In The Argonauts, she writes lovingly of the many-gendered mothers of her heart, the writers and teachers who preceded and guided her, and it's clear to me that she has entered this hallowed pantheon. And so tonight, we welcome one of the many-gendered mothers of many writers' hearts, Maggie Nelson.
Thank you, Catherine. That was really lovely.
I agree, Catherine. Thank you so much. That was so lovely. Thank you. I feel much less alone. I don't know who you're talking about, but she sounds great, and I'm glad to be here.
As an added bonus tonight, because of the weirdness of Zoom, Maggie has graciously agreed to read part of her work in progress, and we will begin the evening with that. As Catherine said, the title of it is On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint. Maggie?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad. It's like I see your numbers. I see that you're out there. We can't really commune, but I feel you, and I'm really grateful to be with you. And I can't wait to hear questions and talk to you in whatever way we can talk. So I'm trying to see if I can not spotlight myself, because I don't know about you, but I cannot watch myself present in the world at close range and also present in the world. So Liz asked if I would read something new, and it won't matter really to anybody but me, but only I know the deep difficulty and kind of what to me felt like heroic efforts I had in finishing this book in the months of March until now. But I have finished it and turned it in, and I'm very pleased about that, and it'll be out in about a year. So I will read to you just the first 4 pages of it, because that seems to me like it needs the least introduction. But I'll just say that it's a pretty long book, a little similar to The Art of Cruelty in its range, but whereas The Art of Cruelty is really focused on art, this chapter, it's called, On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, and the 4 songs are the 4 chapters, which are about, the first one is about art, the second, or freedom in the art world, the second one's about, and in making art, the second one's about sexual freedom, the third one is about freedom in drugs, and the last chapter is about freedom as a regard to the climate crisis. So it's art, sex, drugs, and climate are the 4 songs of Care and Constraint, and then there's an introduction and an afterword. So these are the first few pages of the introduction, and it has in little sections, and this section is, the first one's called Stop Here If You Want to Talk About Freedom. I had wanted to write a book about freedom. I had wanted to write this book at least since the subject emerged as an unexpected subtext in a book of mine about art and cruelty. I had set out to write about cruelty and then found, to my surprise, freedom coming up through the cracks. Light and air into cruelty's stuffy room. Once exhausted by cruelty, I turned to freedom directly. I started with What is Freedom by Hannah Arendt, and from there began to amass my piles. But before long, I diverted and wrote a book about care. Some people thought the book about care was also a book about freedom. This was satisfying, as I too felt this to be the case. For some time, I thought a book on freedom might no longer be necessary, maybe not by me, maybe not by anyone. Can you think of a more depleted, imprecise, or weaponized word? I used to care about freedom, but now I care mostly about love, one friend told me. Another quote, freedom feels like a corrupt and emptied code word for war, a commercial export, something a patriarch might give or rescind, another wrote me. That's a white word, said another. Often I agreed with them. Why not take up with some less contested, obviously timely and worthy value, such as obligation, mutual aid, coexistence, resiliency, sustainability, or what Manolo Callahan has called insubordinate conviviality? Why not acknowledge that freedom's long star turn might finally be coming to a close, and that a continued obsession with it may be a death drive? Your freedom is killing me. Read the signs of protesters in the middle of a pandemic. Your health is not more important than my liberty, maskless others shout back. And yet I still could not quit it. Part of the trouble resides in the word itself, whose meaning is not at all self-evident or shared. In fact, the word operates more like God, in that when we use it, we can never really be sure what exactly we're talking about, or whether we're talking about the same thing. Are we talking negative freedom, positive freedom, anarchist freedom, Marxist freedom, abolitionist freedom, libertarian freedom, white settler freedom, decolonizing freedom, neoliberal freedom, Zapatista freedom, spiritual freedom, and so on? All of which leads to Ludwig Wittgenstein's famous edict, the meaning of a word is its use. I thought of this formulation the other day when on my university campus, I passed by a table with a banner that read, "Stop here if you want to talk about freedom." Boy, do I thought. So I stopped and I asked the young white man, probably an undergraduate, what type of freedom he wanted to talk about. He looked me up and down and then said slowly, with a hint of menace, a hint of insecurity, you know, regular old freedom. I noticed then that he was selling buttons divided into 3 categories: saving the unborn, owning the libs, and gun rights. As Wittgenstein's work makes clear, that the meaning of a word is its use is no cause for paralysis or lament. It can instead act as an incitement to track which language game is being played. Such is the approach taken in the pages that follow, in which freedom acts as a reusable train ticket, marked or perforated by the many stations, hands, and vessels through which it passes. I borrow this metaphor from, as mentioned, Wayne Custenbaum, who once used it to describe, quote, the way a word or a set of words permutates in the works of Gertrude Stein, end quote. What the word means is none of your business, Custenbaum writes, but it is indubitably, I can never say this word, I'm just gonna say undeniably your business where the word travels. For whatever confusions wrought from talking about freedom, they do not in essence differ from the misunderstandings we risk when we talk to one another about other things. And talk to one another we must, even or especially if we are, as poet George Oppen had it, no longer sure of the words. So just a little more, this next section is called A Crisis of Freedom. Looking back, my decision to stick with the term appears to have two roots. The first involves my longstanding frustration with its capture by the right wing as an evidence at the young man's card table. This capture has been underway for centuries. Freedom for us, subjugation for you has been in operation since the nation's founding. But after the 60s, a time during which, as historian Robin D.G. Kelly recalls in Freedom Dreams, freedom was the goal our people were trying to achieve. Free was a verb, it was an act, a wish, a militant demand. Free the land, free your mind, free South Africa, free Angela Davis, free Huey, were the slogans I remember best. After all this, the right wing doubled down on its claim. In just a few brutal neoliberal decades, the rallying cry of freedom, as epitomized in the Freedom Summer, Freedom Schools, Freedom Riders, Women's Lib, and Gay Liberation, was overtaken by the likes of the American Freedom Party, Capitalism and Freedom, that's the Milton Friedman, Operation Enduring Freedom, the Religious Freedom Act, Alliance Defending Freedom, and so much more. This shift has led political philosophers such as Judith Butler to refer to our times as post-liberatory, though as Fred Moten says, pre-liberatory might be just as accurate. Either way, the debate as to where we stand temporally in relation to freedom could be read as a symptom of what Wendy Brown has called a developing crisis of freedom, in which the particular anti-democratic powers of our time, which can flourish even in so-called democracies, have produced subjects, including those working under the banner of progressive politics, who appear, in Brown's words, disoriented as to freedom's value, and have allowed, quote, the language of resistance to take up the ground vacated by a more expansive practice of freedom. In the face of such a developing crisis, sticking with the term seemed to me one way to refuse this trade, to test the word's remaining or evacuated possibilities. The second, which complicates the first, is that I have long had reservations about the emancipatory rhetoric of past eras, especially the kind that treats liberation as a one-time event or event horizon. Nostalgia for prior notions of liberation, many of which depend heavily upon mythologies of revelation, violent upheaval, revolutionary machismo, and teleological progress, often strikes me as not useful or worse in the face of certain challenges, present challenges, such as global warming. Freedom dreams that consistently figure freedom's arrival as a day of reckoning, as in MLK's day when all of God's children will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, can be absolutely crucial to helping us imagine futures that we want. But they can also condition us into thinking of freedom as a future achievement, rather than as an unending present practice, something that is already going on. If ceding freedom to noxious forces is a grievous error, so too is holding on to rote, unventilated concepts of it with a white-knuckled grip. It is for this reason that Michel Foucault's distinction between liberation, conceived of as a momentary act, and practices of freedom, conceived of as ongoing, has been key for me. As when Foucault writes, liberation paves the way for new relationships, which must be controlled by practices of freedom. I like this proposition very much. I would even say it is a guiding principle of this book. There is no doubt it will strike many as a giant buzzkill. Power relationships, control, isn't the whole point to ditch all that? Maybe, but be careful what you wish for. This is Wendy Brown's point when she says that the freedom to self-govern, quote, requires inventive and careful use of power rather than rebellion against authority. It is sober, it is exhausting, and it is without parents, end quote. I think that she is probably right, even if sober, exhausting, and without parents is a tough rallying cry, especially for those who already feel exhausted and uncared for. But I do find this approach more inspiring and workable than waiting for, quote, the final big night of liberation, the apocalyptic showdown, followed by the sudden and miraculous eruption of a totally different kind of human and social relations, end quote, as French economist Frederick Lordin has put it. Letting go of our hopes for this big night, Lordin argues, may be the best means of saving the idea of liberation. I tend to agree. Moments of liberation, such as those of revolutionary rupture or personal peak experiences, matter enormously, as they remind us that conditions that once seemed fixed are not, and create opportunities to alter course, to decrease domination, and to start anew. But the practice of freedom, the morning after and the morning after that, is what, if we are lucky, takes up most of our waking lives. This book is about that experiment, unending. All right.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Especially coming after last night's debate. In medieval times, they applied leeches to take out the poisons of things. And I feel like I've just had some lovely leeches applied to take out the poison of the tenor of last night's debate. People have said that you defy classification. In her introduction, Catherine said all the genres you have written in. I do not think you defy classification. I think you inhabit all these different classifications, and one only has to follow along. And the reason it's so easy, I had the pleasure of rereading your books, because I know we've done this before. In Bluets, you say, I compose everything as if I were writing a letter. Can you expand on that a little bit in terms of the tone and your approach to the tone of what you're doing?
Sure, and I appreciate what you have said about I appreciate what you say about inhabiting genres, because I don't, I'm really interested in what is criticism, what is art writing, what is poetry, what is, for lack of a better word, creative nonfiction, what is memoir, what is autobiography. I'm really interested in all these questions, so I don't care if someone wants to say like, oh, Bluets is a novel or whatever. Like people can say anything they want, but it's like, I don't mean to make like a mess. I mean to like inhabit things and explore them in a precise fashion. Okay, so that said, yeah, so you were asking about, what the last part was about?
That you said that you compose everything.
Oh, the letter, yeah. Yes. Well, I don't know if I think that's true altogether. I think I came up in lyric poetry, and there's always, in most of the writing I love so much, not all of it, but a lot of it, from like Paul Celan to Emily Dickinson to Robert Creeley or whatever, always had a very, Frank O'Hara always had a very strong sense of an I and a you, or an I and a thou. And I really liked a kind of denudative pronouns type of approach. And I really liked experimenting with forms of intimate or civic address and how those things mixed up. So I kind of came from the laboratory of that in poetry. And I think that I'm interested, and it's hard to do, but I'm interested in, okay, let me back up. I'm not interested really, like people will sometimes say like, oh, Maggie Nelson, she really, mixes up the personal and the cerebral or something. And I don't like perceive it like that, because I don't perceive them as like different categories. I think it's really important to try and have heat and presence in your critical writing, because you are addressing I'm talking to somebody. I don't know who I'm talking to, but I'm saying I wanted to write a book about freedom. Like I'm telling you, Liz, like I'm telling somebody this. I mean, it's, like all writing, it's like delusional narcissism. It's you talking to yourself in a closed room, creating fake interlocutors. But I think that there's always an internal address that's phantasmagoric that goes on during writing. And I think that that's true I think that's true for me of criticism as well. In Bluets, I was really interested in that as like a form of madness. I talk about Newton and Wittgenstein and even Nietzsche, like just the way that philosophy, a lot of it can be read as, people, like I kind of joke in Bluets about Newton talking about that he had this assistant that he was describing his experiments with color to, and then later on he admitted there had been no assistant, and he was just describing his experiments to himself. And Wittgenstein is endlessly talking. He's endlessly self-correcting by saying, "Oh, but now you are saying it's as if this, but that is not what you said. Whatever before." I mean, it's this. So it's just, if it weren't philosophy, it would sound like madness, and I'm very interested in that as well.
One of the reasons why the word letter seems to fit things is, even in your most far-ranging works, Bluets must be one of them, probably The Art of Cruelty is another, and it sounds like the present one is also that way. The different subjects or forms of address are neither chronologically arranged nor thematically arranged, and yet you're drawn from one to the other by the force of your writing. You somehow manage to speak of very rarefied subjects in a very vernacular way, which is unusual. So that makes a sort of cohesion. But I wonder structurally, do you just bop from one thing to the next, or do you have some idea of the form before you begin? Our students always ask me to ask that question, so I'm asking.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think form is, I do feel for me that it follows content, and I don't feel, again, with this kind of idea of like, being like a, genre buster or something, like I don't find formal experiment, unless it was like in the old days when I'd be like, oh, that's like get drunk and write a sestina or something. Like I don't actually find it all that pleasant to be in the dark about the form something wants to come in. I think it's confusing, and it can be bewildering for a long time. And I think that it was funny because when I was naming this book recently, a hard book to name, it's kind of a clunky name, but I felt like in all my books, I've kind of done what I did and then kind of looked back to try and find a title that could also name the form in some way, So it was important to me that this title have, there are 4 chapters and I wanted to name them. I named them as 4 songs, but it was kind of like that became the form, so I wanted to gesture to it. Whereas words like in Jane, a murder, or The Art of Cruelty, a reckoning, or even Bluets, which is like to me, it's like the plural of these, each thing is like a bluet to me. So like, I really liked this twinning with form and content, and like to gesture to that, but I definitely, you definitely have to wait to see what you did before you know what you did.
Right. You just mentioned Jane and the red parts. Part of the rereading process that's so fascinating is I now see absolutely Jane and the red parts and the Art of Cruelty as a trilogy, which of course you didn't write them as that, but for those who might not have read, Jane Jane was the sister of Maggie's mother who was murdered. There was a trial. A man called Collins was found guilty, and then very many years later, there was evidence found to accuse another man. And Jane is, if I may say this, very loosely organized. There are all kinds of entries and lyric thoughts. The red parts, which follows it, is much more structured in a way. Maggie follows the trial, she thinks about it, but it has the same large dimension that Jane does. And it's very unusual to write 2 books, which I know a long time in that way. How did you come to decide on the red parts as the one that would follow that?
Well, that whole thing was just really weird because, I mean, first of all, I really, we're vibing in that I too think of those books now. Again, like you kind of see what you did, you see the mess you made in retrospect, but I too think of those books as a real trilogy because I think of them as attacking a kind of problem about violence and representation from 3 different ways. Like one is Jane is about the unknowable and the unknown and about white space and about filling in information when you have very little. The red parts is about organizing information when suddenly there's too much, and it's especially visual information, because that book was really, Jane was really about, because her murder was in 1969, Jane was really about archival research about something that happened a long time ago. The red parts was about something happening in the present. It was about, it was my like Didion-esque experiment with going to a trial with a yellow pad and taking notes and seeing if I could, just, again, like I was saying with genre, like, could I, pull off some kind of, true crime courtroom thing while I also meditated on the difference between social and criminal justice, which was kind of my undercurrent of that book, because Jane, my aunt, had been interested in civil rights and social justice, and there was this kind of, there's an award for her at University of Michigan for the student at the law school most dedicated to social justice, and then the language about justice in her trial was so, completely alien to her life's work. So anyway, yeah, and then The Art of Cruelty was about taking all these questions I thought about in those two books about violence and representation, and thinking about how art, helps us or reenacts those same questions. So they definitely all perseverate on similar themes. But yeah, I didn't, Jane, I kind of decided to write, or kind of got up the courage to write over the years. The Red Parts was a hard book for me because it kind of just, I guess like the image that comes to my mind was just like, it was like a shit waterfall, and I was just kind of like writing my way out of it because I really had felt done with the topic. I'd worked on Jane for about 8 years and I felt really done with it. But as the opening of Jane says, that right as that book was going to print and was, in page proofs, I got a call from, the Michigan State Police saying they were about to arrest a new suspect in my aunt's case after 36 years, and they were currently casing his house. And they thought that my mother and I should know that this arrest was imminent. And I just thought, you've got to be, fucking kidding me. So that was really, and then from then on, it was just kind of, that call came in the fall of 2014. And then his trial was in June of 2015. So it was a very quick period of time. And then I moved to LA and I wrote the book from June after the trial till I think I turned that book in like October. It was a very, very, I've never written anything in that kind of time frame. So it was weird.
It does not show. I mean, it's as much, it's as much like ordinary journalism as, I don't know, a seed is to the flower that comes out of it. Right. I mean, it's a very lyric book in its way. Here's what I don't know. I read it twice, and I don't know if you thought that the man who was finally, the jury found guilty, I don't know if you agreed with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. He actually died in prison on Christmas of this past year in 2019. So that secret has gone to the grave with him,
And do you feel he was justly convicted, or do you not know?
I'm like, into prison abolition and stuff. So I don't think that, I'm not into the language of just convictions or justly sentenced is not one I would use. But I think that, I don't, I don't know. I have no idea. It's not a question I think about very often. But I guess if I were forced into a corner, I might say 80% he was guilty, 20% not. I don't know.
Well, it's just that you have us readers wondering as we go along. Did he, not that did he deserve what he got, but was he, could she put this to rest? Could your mom put it to rest some way? But then you write a lot about nothing is ever put to rest.
Well, I think that's the whole point about criminal justice and social justice, which is the idea that something's put to rest by a conviction is not a social justice, in my opinion, claim. So the book was very focused on what was left behind with that point,
Right. The Argonauts, let's move away from that briefly. One of the rarest representations of pregnancy and childbirth that I can think of in literature. Am I wrong that there are very few? I think I'm not wrong.
I don't know of very many. I have to say. I mean, I looked around trying to find some when I was writing that book. It seemed like it kind of like a minefield of writing it wrong. So I really couldn't. I mean, in a book of mine that is about the New York School that Catherine mentioned, I have a chapter on Bernadette Mayer, some of you might know, and you know, oh, I have to tell you something, you guys. I'm single parenting, and you're about to see what that looks like. Hi, sweetie. Hang on. I'm gonna.
This is Iggy. Hi, Iggy. Whoa.
Hey, I'm back. Okay, and I was saying that was the child that I once wrote about giving birth to, and there he was. Anyway, Bernadette Mayer has this great book, The Desires of Mothers to Please Others in Letters, in which I read those scenes, but I mean, there are things in fiction, but I hadn't read anything else really that I could think of. So. Oh, Carol Mesa has a book, I guess, The Room Lit by Roses, that has a birth scene. But I mean, really, but think about it. That's not very many. So, for something that's been done by millions and millions and millions of people. So,
why do you think that is?
I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, I think if men had babies, we'd have lots of representations. I mean, I think that's what it's about. I think it's a misogynist thing. I definitely think that, you know, it seems like a huge oddity that this is happening over millennia and is so rarely written about, even a little.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, I mean, it's not, you know, I mean, well, so many things to say. I mean, there's so many things historically to say about women and maternity and publishing and the capacity to be a writer and also be someone with children. There's a lot to say on that account. You know, from Mary Shelley on down, there's a lot to say about the human experience and what counts as human experience and as, you know, existentially important experience. I mean, there's so much to say. There's a lot to say about matrophobia, internalized matrophobia. Anyway, I could go on and on. But.
And also the maternal and supportive aspect of life and who owns it or who doesn't. And, you know, women are blamed for not, for working, but they're not given the support that they need to not work. I mean, there's just so many issues involved with that.
Yeah, I mean, I was asked so many times after the Argonauts. It was so funny because I got asked so many times if I felt like I keep putting this on gallery view just to remind myself that you're there. I can't. So like, if you see me looking up, that's why I'm doing that. You know, I had to remind myself, oh my God, now I lost what I was going to say. It was about maternity. Say it again.
Maternal, the supportive aspect of it.
Yeah, anyway, it'll come back to me, but go ahead. Yeah.
But that book is about a lot more than pregnancy and childbirth. How did you think of combining the gender elements and the maternal elements and all of those things and putting them together? I mean, how did you conceive of the book to begin with, I guess is my question.
The Argonauts was not a book that I conceived of, and I was not very, I was actually working on, I mean, as per I just read to you guys, I was working on this book about freedom was the next book I wanted to write because it did, the freedom book did come out of the Art of Cruelty book, and I began researching it and I was starting to work on it. And then I was also working on trying to get pregnant, and I started kind of writing more diaristic things about that and about my life with my partner. And then I had done a couple largish pieces of kind of occasional writing. One was a talk I gave about Eve Sedgwick at CUNY, my alma mater, and where Eve used to teach. And the other was a piece I wrote for a friend of mine, A.L. Steiner, for a show of hers called Puppies and Babies. And I think I was looking at those long pieces of writing about gender. And then I was looking at this kind of writing I was doing about maternity. And I was thinking, you know, gosh, there's all this kind of queer stuff over here. And then there's all this stuff about this experience over here, you know, what would, you know, because queerness has been so often historically opposed to procreation, I thought, what would it be like if just as like a day of an experiment in my office, if I just like if I just started layering them side by side. So I did, and it seemed kind of interesting, but it was not, I didn't think it was a great idea. I don't know, I felt like a lot of things, everything always feels like too personal when I'm starting it, and then I kind of acclimate myself to what's going to be exposed, and then it doesn't feel like an exposure by the end at all. So that was kind of how that came about. And I also am grateful to Emma Graff for saying what she forgot after the Argonauts. People kept asking me, thank you, that reminds me of what I was going to say is after the Argonauts, people kept asking me a lot if I'd felt like I'd lost, my mind or my intellectual life, after having a baby. And I think that I can see Kendra Leiter Johnson's baby too, so cute, love it. And it was really weird because, it was like I'd written this book in the first year after he was born and then published it when he was just 2 or turning 3. And I kind of felt like, well, I don't know, what do you think? Do you think I've lost my mind? Like it was, it was odd. Not that I feel like there isn't a kind of, there's something really to be said for the different temporal space and time and mind frame of dealing with, an infant. But I guess what was amazing to me about it was that the opposition between, the maternity and the intellectual life was like being put to me as an intellectual standing in front of you. So it was just very interesting to see it kind of like, it was like no proof could possibly ever dispel this. It's so deeply ingrained,
Exactly right. One of the reasons it completely works here and all your books that meld so many different things is that the Emily Dickinson dictum, tell all the truth but tell it slant. You could have that as over your computer sewed in embroidery, because you talk about so many theoretical things, but you're not a polemicist. That's what's so fascinating about your style. You think a lot of things that are very complex and interesting, but you tell it slant, as our dear Emily recommended, and it makes it work really beautifully. Have your views changed since you wrote your early books in any important way that you know of? I know mine have.
Like views about anything in particular, or just views in general?
Because you've created a lot of books and they have different theses in a certain way.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, maybe I should. I mean, I feel like I came up in a kind of spoken word-ish, do-it-yourself, punkish culture, right, kind of post or mid-AIDS in New York City, and there was definitely not a feeling of preciousness or regret about letting a stream of writing come through you and marking a moment. And I think I've really tried to keep that feeling through all my books, where I don't really look back on them. And people will often say, do you think you're still the self that you were? I think of them also as aesthetic objects. Like, I don't really think of them as selves that I was. I think of them as like aesthetic problems that I solved using the self as a prism or something like that. And I feel proud of how things have been solved, I mean, I think that the Freedom book, what you're describing as telling it slant or not being a polemicist, I feel like it nearly killed me trying to talk freedom slant. Nearly killed me, but I tried.
Right.
I mean, it's very hard to write. I'm sure you all feel like this. It's very hard to write in a time like the present, where the pressure towards polemic is very strong. It's both incredibly strong and incredibly boring. Like more boring than it ever has been, and more kind of imperative than it ever has been. And I think those moments are very difficult for a writer to find, her place to stand and be. But such is our task,
I have very strong feelings, and I think you do too, about the use of art in the world, and whether it's there to solve anything or fix anything or merely be itself. And I wish you could expand on that. I know it comes up from time to time in your work.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the chapter on art in the Freedom book is really focused on precisely that. I think my feelings on that subject are probably, potentially unpopular, in that chapter, in the art chapter, I kind of go through a very long explication of the notion of the reparative or of care and the relationship of art that art might have towards those goals. And I kind of begin that chapter saying, you know, why is it that I'm kind of generally pro-care, but yet the idea of like having art do reparative work, like I have like a viscerally negative reaction to. And so the chapter kind of takes that as its starting point and tries to explore it from there, you know. And I think that I have there's a quote from Eileen Myles that I use in that chapter that I really love and has meant a lot to me for a long time, where it's in this little chapbook called We the Poets, and Eileen says something like, they're talking to a New York Times critic who's said like that poetry readings are so boring and so awful. And Eileen says, what you're hearing is aesthetic failure, Judith. It happens. And then Eileen says, but the important thing is that what you're hearing is the real and irregular news of how others around you think and feel. And to me, like that real and irregular news, I mean, it has a kind of, William Carlos Williams, like, feeling to it, but that real and irregular news is so much more important to me than in a way the reparative. I mean, you could get kind of semantic and say it is reparative to hear the real and irregular news, and that's fine. But to me, it's more a kind of, ecstasis of being alive and witnessing motley expression that means so much to me, you know.
And you're also saying that it's not an obligation. It's something that happens because it's there, but it's not an obligation for an artist to feel.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really great quote that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, I was just reading an interview the other day that I found very heartening called, which I send out to you all because it is related to the Zoom time, saying like, when we're not together and we're not alone. We're not together, but we're not alone. But, Fred Moten is quoting somebody else, but he says, what we're interested in, trying to hold each other without holding each other to anything. And I thought that was so lovely, just in that sense of, when a lot of my freedom book is about, what if we have a sense of holding each other? And again, that's kind of like witnessing the real and irregular news of each other, but that's not about holding each other to something that we might moralize into an obligation, and I think that even though on the one hand, you might say like in COVID or something that we've never seen more clearly, the necessity of obligation to like a shared collective. I mean, in some sense, that's very true. But I also, not in some sense, in most every sense it's true. But I think we're also seeing the limitations of like the pragmatic limitations of a moralizing, force of obligation that presumes that some people know what obligation is and how it should be performed, and other people are doing it all wrong. And it's not that I don't have strong feelings about those matters in my daily life. It's more that I'm curious about what the dismantling of that binary, what forms of liberation that might make possible for everybody, And
it's a very good answer. I don't know where I read, was you or somebody talking about you, that you and your partner have very different views of language. You're involved with considering the inexpressible expressible, and he thinks that words are never enough. Is that right, Harry?
That was right, as a kind of framing device for the Argonauts, because that was one of our original ongoing debates when we met. Harry was kind of I can't remember, it's been so long, like what's it called? He was kind of like an anti-civ person when we met. He was like into like some really radical green ecological stuff and was really deep into kind of a kind of abolition of culture feeling that he does not feel anymore. But, we met, and it was kind of like Green Acres, which none of you probably know about. Some of you might, but it was kind of like, I was like, I'm from the big city, and he was like, let's get as far away from all this as possible. But I think that the misnomer or the mistake of that, of framing the Argonauts that way, was that a lot of people read it as if like Harry was a person of few words. And I think, it's really important to note that you can deeply suspect language and use it all the time, and use it with, with ecstasy and with, voluminousness, and Harry most certainly does. And so, I think he was so irritated. This is not the only reason, but he was so irritated with the idea of him as a person with very few words that he, wanted to write his own book after the Argonauts, and he did. And it came out on March 17th, which, as you might recall, was probably the moment that your life was permanently changing going into lockdown. So anyway, it was also the date that John Bolton, remember John Bolton? The date that John Bolton's book was supposed to come out, whatever. It was like a whole other moment, but it was kind of sad because his book he didn't get to go around and do all his events. But it's a really spectacular book, I think. And in some ways, if you read it, you'll note that it's much more linguistically promiscuous and fecund than I am. I'm a serial minimalist,
Yeah,
like a boiler down at heart, not in my talking, but in my writing. And he is loquaciousness is a religion for him in some ways, and so.
One of my students asked me to ask you about beginnings as a writer. How did you always think of yourself as a writer? Did you come early to have the success that you now have? But the trajectory of your life as a writer.
I mean, as Wayne Kustenbaum has said, I've spent, except for the past 3 years from when the Argonauts came out, it's definitely been a demi-monde existence in my writing life. So a lot has changed, but no, there's not been like, until the kind of surprise interest in that book, I've just been kind of laboring along. But I don't know. I was not, like I said, and I hate to repeat myself, but I definitely came up in poetry and in, moved to New York when I was 21, just wanting to go, see Patti Smith buy her newspaper at Gem Spa and stuff, and walk by like Jimmy Schuyler's plaque, and I, it was very, I was just kind of following hunches about things that seemed like they were meaningful to me, and really loved. I was also into dance then, postmodern dance or what have you, and also, had a kind of more delusional idea that I would work as a dancer in New York. And so, for a lot of years I did both things, and it was a lot of fun, but I did feel like there was this kind of critical mindedness and rigor that lyric poetry is very rigorous. I'm not getting on poetry or dance. I'm just saying that for me, there was something about like, I could feel my mind wanting to do more long form, rigorous work than I was doing. And I didn't know what form or shape I really wanted it to take. And so I went back to graduate school, like I said, at CUNY, and had a fantastic time, and partly went there because the people who were there, like Wayne Kustenbaum and Eve Sedgwick and Luke Manand, who you probably know, Liz, is not there anymore, but a lot of people had lives as writers that I admired, and I wanted to get more education, but I didn't want to be mired in a wholly academic life. And I felt like CUNY seemed like, the place to go explore what that might mean to me. And it ended up being a really good decision. And I wrote several books of poetry during my time there, and then I wrote my dissertation there, and then just, felt, and also learned. Marianne Cause, who's an amazing surrealism and Dada scholar, was another teacher of mine there. And she really taught me how to, not even just how to write about art, but just told me I could write about art. I did a lot of, she sent us a lot to the Met and to the MoMA to just write about what we saw. And that was very freeing to me as well. So from there, I just felt very emboldened to write any kind of book I wanted.
Lastly, before we open this up to students, do you consider any smaller than the many names you named in your book influencers on you, the people who have particularly influenced you as a writer or a thinker?
I mean, I feel like all I do is name people who've influenced me as a writer or thinker. So it would be like really,
there are
it would be really like high stakes secrecy for me to pull out like the real ones, because they're all, my writing is just littered to a fault, as you can hear me try and read to you, like quote, end quote, quote, end quote, like with them. So I don't know, I'll try and think if there's anybody I haven't yet mentioned, but it would be a hard task.
Before you met any of them when you were young, is there anybody who you really admired? Let's put it that way.
Like when I was really young, you know?
Yeah, before you went to CUNY, let's say, when you were bartending.
Oh, well, when I was bartending, I mean, I just loved, you know, I loved all the poets, you know. I mean, Bob Creeley was a really important guy for me. I mean, I thought I was the only person in the world that Bob Creeley like wrote postcards to saying your poems are great, but it turns out he did that to everybody who wrote him, but I didn't know that. And that was super important to me, you know. A long time ago. I mean, obviously Sontag, Dostoevsky. When I was in college, I was a huge Dostoevsky fan. I mean, bizarrely, I took like classes at UC Berkeley every summer on Russian literature. I mean, all that's faded away, but that was, I don't know. So, but nothing that makes any sense really. But
Okay, I think because there's so many people here, I'm going to stop this our discussion a little bit early and open up the conversation to questions from the people who were here. Catherine, do you have some to mention?
I do, and so there's actually two that I feel like kind of are in the same vein, so I'm going to just ask both of them. Laura asked, your influence on Harry Dodge and My Meteorite is clear. How has Harry's work in the visual arts influenced or continued to influence your writing? And then Mads is asking, the way you talk about fluidity and genre and form in your writing makes me wonder if you have a cross-disciplinary creative practice. Do you feel attached to fluidity in making? What are the practices outside of writing that inform your writing?
Wow.
Boy, I really doubt that Harry would buy that I've influenced him, but I don't know, and I don't know about his visual art influencing me. I don't like feel that in any direct sense. I think that I have a lucky marriage in that we talk all the time. I mean, sadly, as you've seen my child come in, he's camping right now, so I'm now like bereft of my conversational mate. But we talk about art all the time, and I really I just like talking to Harry about art. I like also seeing, art and performance and everything, and writing. But, there's like a really, the fine line between garbage and art is really interesting to me. Like our whole garage is just garbage that he turns into sculpture. And I get angry because I'm like, there's all this garbage. We just live in, he just pulls things off the street and it's just shellacks them to other things. And, I get really irritated. And it's like, we just live in garbage. I mean, it's funny, I wrote a long piece on Carolee Schneemann, whom I adore and who died, I guess, just last year? I don't know, what's time, what is history? I don't know. Anyway, but Carolee, I went to go visit her at her house up in near New Paltz to write the piece. And we just talked for a long time about art and garbage and she showed me all what cat piss does to her sculptures in the studio and how she's never had enough money to get any kind of climate control. And anyway, I guess all of that I just find very interesting because, Harry's book, My Meteorite, is really interested in what makes material, what makes something human, what makes something feel like it is, worth something, what makes something feel like it's alien or native. I mean, hence the title, My Meteorite, because, he is very, he taught me this, which is, so you're all going to say, duh, all 196 of you. But to me, this was like very novel as a concept that, that everything on the periodic table, the elements, everything that we know exists, is all that we know. Like space is only that so far as we know. Like there's not everything that comes to us, like the meteorite, is just stuff we already know. It's just elements, that we already know exist. And that's just amazing to me. Like, if you think like in some sci-fi way that there's something out there, some completely other thing. But Harry is very interested in a kind of very wide sense of material belonging, that has been very influential to me and moving to me in ways that that might not be native to me in a more linguistic sphere that I work in. So anyway, there's all that. That was the first one. The second one was it was about fluidity and something. I don't know what, but cross-disciplinary. No, I'm like a completely monomaniacal person in that, like, I just write. I mean, I used to dance, like I said. I used to waitress, you know, but beyond that, like I don't do, you know, I don't do, I wish I did. I was actually speaking with Annie Diller the other day, probably a writer that many of you know, who was also a teacher of mine a long time ago. And you know, Annie now spends a lot of time painting, and she's been painting for the last many years, and instead of writing. And she was kind of trying to tell me, you gotta have something else, you know, if you can't write anymore. And I was like, fuck, like what am I gonna do? So I don't know. I mean, you know, but actually I had a therapist who told me also during the pandemic that I really need some hobbies. And I was like, hobbies? I was like, I don't hobby. I'm like, I need time to write, I need time to think, and I have to parent, and I have to like cook and clean. I was like, but a hobby, you know, but I'm still out, it's all out there for me, but I don't have any.
Thank you. Catherine?
So this is actually a question from me. I'm going to assert my privilege as the introducer. It feels like climate change is a little bit of a departure from like the intellectual path that you've hewed in the past. And I know that you're a voracious reader. I'm just sort of curious, like how that's manifested in your readings. Like what have you been reading that to influence you on the climate crisis, and how are you viewing it?
Oh yeah, well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I read a lot. I've read a lot. I read a lot to write the chapter on climate in my book. I wouldn't say I read a lot of literature. I'm not like doing the kind of Amitav Ghosh thing of like, we need fiction about the climate to help us see our future or something. Like, I mean, I think that that's probably true, but it's not my gig. And in fact, actually in my climate chapter, this kind of goes along with what Liz we were saying earlier. I'm not really, I don't really look to art to get us out of like what we're in, you know? So I don't, you know, I'm interested in seeing how climate comes up. And I'm interested, I actually taught yesterday on Zoom, an essay by Toni Morrison, some of you might know, called The Future of Time, which is a really interesting essay. And I am interested in, you know, she kind of ends The Future of Time talking about, I mean, she doesn't say it like this, but, you know, I would say it like this, but, you know, like the end of white time, whatever that might mean, like may be, you know, the true abolition and the thing that needs to happen, but it doesn't mean that there's not other things, other ways of temporally thinking after that. So, and then she uses a bunch of literary examples of ways that we might think time otherwise. And now you're talking about time, not the climate, but obviously, you know, the climate is a temporal problem, which is why some people have called for it to be addressed in like a narrative fashion. It's a temporal problem, you know, like COVID is giving us a kind of mini version of this where like we can't really, you know, I mean, in my most compassionate moods, when you're not angry at the oil executives and, you know, and Trump and everybody else and all the, you know, villains and thieves who've, you know, sacked and robbed the planet and the present and future, when you're putting that anger aside, just, you know, easy to do, right? Throw it to the shelf. But like when you're in a more compassionate mood, you know, it's very difficult for you. It hasn't been difficult for all humans, clearly. If you think about like the Iroquois 7 generations law or things like that, it hasn't, you know, always been difficult, but it's been, you know, somewhat difficult to think about prevention and deep planning. And for humans, even though we do have the capacity, we are, you know, we're vexed by immediate greed and need, some more than others. So I think that in the climate chapter, I make a lot, I mean, I've read a million things, but I think that chapter also leans kind of heavily on this Chakrabarty essay a lot of you probably know about the climate, wherein he encourages us to think about our conceptual life, including all of our ideas about freedom and anything else, justice, whatever, encourages us to recognize that all of that thinking is built on, has all been, thought with oil. Is there kind of, as you said, like the mansion of modern freedoms is a kind of, it has been the history of fossil fuels in a certain way, and that some of our most cherished ideals are imbricated with the history of fossil fuels in very profound ways. And this is where someone like Donna Haraway might come in with her book, Staying with the Trouble, where she says, think we must think, but it really matters what we partner with in our thinking. And, we've been partnering with oil to think. And that I can enumerate for you the millions of ways in which that's true. We're doing it right now with my Zoom light and my computer and everything else, I think that to me was a way of getting underneath the concept of freedom in a way that was particularly unnerving and but also invigorating, rather than thinking, oh, should we have smaller or bigger government, or oh, shall we have, but more to think like all of those conversations have been, and there are a lot of people who have written on this. Timothy Mitchell's book called Carbon Democracy, which link in with the problem I am discussing in the opening I read for you, which is that you might say, and this is true, that what we're talking about as modern democracies are not really democracies, or are imperfect democracies, or are failing democracies. But at the same time, there is still the problem that, so-called democratic forms of government have not served to address the climate crisis for us. And that is something that we have to reckon with, not to move towards an autocracy, or necessarily towards, a society of, tribalistic mutual aid, but that we have to reckon with the depth of the problem, which is very deep, Anyway, sorry, that's my climate speech.
Thank you. Leah Greenwell, having written so many different books in different forms, is there a typical arc of pain and pleasure to your process? Where is it hardest for you? What are the moments you revel in?
That's a great question. It's a great question. I actually was writing about this in the Freedom book, where I don't know, I'd be curious, Liz, to see what you think, or anyone. I see Philip Lopet here as well, or anyone, but I don't know, writing is becoming less and less fun for me all the time. I feel like when I was younger, I think I thought writing and fun and pleasure had a relationship. And now I feel like they've kind of had a divorce, and yet my commitment is all the more stronger to writing than ever before too. So I think that that's very fascinating, and is, probably Freud would have a lot to say about. And I actually say that kiddingly about Freud, about the pleasure, principle and the death drive, but actually because a lot of this book I've been working on has actually been, about what is, when is freedom a death drive? What does it mean to move towards freedom as a form of pleasure? Those are actually questions, quite seriously on my mind. But I think that, there's there's surface pleasures and there's deep pleasures. A lot of writers will say it's a deep pleasure to have written.
Ah, yes.
I think it's a deep pleasure to live a life in thought, and it's a deep pleasure to have been able to articulate ideas that otherwise, I think part of the pain of the pandemic, which you just witnessed with, the complete collapse of childcare, is, I can feel that my mind is, that it's like a form of torture to not be able to ever think, or to have any time to think. So that's not precisely pleasure, but it obviously is doing something very meaningful for me to be able to spend the time with thinking and concentration and articulation. And that's true whether it's poetry that's an emanation of a grief or a feeling of love that you want to get down. And it's true of more what, Liz, you were describing as more, esoteric ideas that still long for form.
Pleasure is never a word I would associate with writing. I'm one of the people who pleasure comes from having written. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's my life, except for my family, in the sense that I talk fast and I think fast, but I write very slowly. And my head is like what the Buddhists call drunken monkey.
Right, yeah.
And the only way that ever gets sorted out is from writing. I write to learn what I really think, not that I think on a superficial level, but what I think about something on a deeper level. And I think a lot of people do that.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's
Yeah.
a factor. Philip, are you around can you talk? No, probably not. Are you there? No, well, or maybe he's muted or something. I think I did see him there. Catherine, another question?
Yeah, sort of going off of that, Anne McGrath wants you to describe your work process, how it evolves from first draft to something so lovely.
Oh man. I can really tell that I've been away from people for a long time, because like I'm just feeling like you guys are so nice. I feel like I just feel like I'm like, oh my God, I haven't heard anybody say words like lovely and me in the same sentence for months. I hear a lot of "I hate you, Mom" is what I hear. So okay, putting that aside, I don't, God, process. I don't know. It's like by any means necessary. I don't know. It's just kind of I mean, again, like, I mean, we're all kind of pandemic minded, but like, every life circumstance that you're in, or every one that I've been in, has had a different kind of process that has allowed me, like when you're young, maybe you can stay up really late, maybe you can write drunk, when you're older, maybe you get up at 4, I've to write this freedom book, which was due on September 1st. I mean, I've got up I got up at 4 o'clock every day of the pandemic and wrote until 7 just to get it done. It was really arduous, but that's not anything like what I've done before. I don't like the morning. I don't like that at all. But it was like absolutely, there was just no other, that was just it, So I think it's just, like I said, kind of by any means necessary, I mean, I think that in terms of drafting, well, this connects to the pleasure conversation. I really like editing. I don't really like writing at all. Like, I used to like it when I was like, just kind of I don't know, maybe I'm like one of the last people, I'm sure there are a few people on this Zoom who wrote on a typewriter, but I wrote on a typewriter for many years, actually. I wrote poetry only on a typewriter for many years, and would just do draft after draft after draft in a typewriter. It felt really crucial to me. And that felt kind of pleasurable, but just to watch words amassing in that way, or to do kind of fun experiments. But no, I mean, I mean, it depends on the project. I mean, a lot of projects of mine are research heavy. And so I feel like, if you put a lot of research in, I mean, I just spent a couple of years reading everything about freedom I could find, from Milton Friedman to Zapatista manifestos. I just read everything. And eventually, like, there's like a tipping point where I start to make sentences, like I start to talk back to everything I read. And then, and then a lot of my first drafts have a lot of talking with other people, as you say, Liz, like trying to find what I think. And then I have to, a really smart friend of mine, his name is Anthony McCann. He wrote a great book last year called Shadowlands about the militia movement in the Northwest and about Ammon Bundy, which I recommend to all of you guys, especially those of you in nonfiction. I think it's a really fascinating book, a fascinatingly written, a beautifully written book. But Anthony read an early draft of my freedom book, and he was like, you use quotes sometimes like perfectly, and then the other ones are a pillow, like to soothe yourself, and the other ones are a shield to like defend yourself. And he was like, you got to go through, and everyone that's a shield and everyone that's a pillow you have to take out and say in your own words. And that was really good. And that's the kind of advice that I often have to give myself, which is a process of being, like Liz was saying, getting closer and closer to what you think. And I'm not ashamed of that kind of thinking with others, but there does come a time when, like, you're not writing just like recreational pastiche, you're not just like a Tumblr feed, you need to, and also what Liz was saying about polemic, it's like one thing I find very difficult, but that I identify as a goal in my writing, is writing towards assertion while still writing away from polemic. And that tension is very fascinating to me, and one that I find a kind of formal problem as much as a ethical problem,
Right. The only writer I actually ever heard of who enjoyed writing as he went along was the writer A.J. Liebling, who used to sit in his office at the New Yorker. He was a very Falstaffian, funny writer, and very had a great encyclopedic knowledge of a lot of different fields. And he used to sit there laughing at his own jokes. And he was very funny. And then he'd rush out of the office and go to the writer sitting at his desk next to him and read aloud what he just read, because it was so excellent. And everybody else around him, they'd be foaming at the mouth. And
Right.
totally
Yeah.
but he was having a wonderful time, and everybody loved him anyway. But that,
I mean, I really think that like the discourse about pleasure is fascinating. And I think that one thing that's important is to kind of like, why I'm kind of talking about deep pleasure of like having written is that I do think it's important to like, you can differ, it's kind of like the practices of, freedom versus the moments of liberation. Like you can, I think there's a very deep pleasure to be taken in like in having a thorough life of the mind. And I think that, Eve Sedgwick actually writes about this, I think really in a fantastic fashion in some of her writing about, she has an essay called Jane Austen and the Masturbating Girl that got her, just the title alone became a kind of right-wing, whipping post back in the 90s when it was put into like an MLA. Oh, those were the good old days, right? When we weren't just like waiting for the Proud Boys to come around and kick butt, but like, but in Jane Austen, The Masturbating Girl, she says when she's addressing the kind of right-wing attack on her as like all that's wrong with the academy, what she says, and I think that she was right. She was like, it's not just about like lewdness or anything. It's that, writing the way I do about the things I love, like Jane Austen and masturbation or whatever, like I am the self-pleasuring person that that people don't think should be paid for what self-pleasures you, that it's disgusting that you have like a job where you can spend time, writing about things that you love and loving your work. And she said, I reject that. She said, that is what we desire. And I always found that very, in a culture that kind of likes to be like, well, I hate writing and it's really painful, but God damn it, I do it anyway. I also think it's also fine to say, no, it is a deep pleasure and it's a deep privilege. And it is something that if it's remunerated, that is, can be a complicated thing and a beautiful thing,
Exactly. Maybe we have time for one more question, Catherine. Do you have lots more, or?
Actually, I don't. I feel like everybody's gotten kind of Zoom shy. That's
maybe it's just because I'm talking so much.
Absolutely. Listen, we're so grateful that you came this evening. Thank you so much, and putting up with Zoom and its oddities.
Well, good.
I look forward to any next iteration of Maggie Nelson in the world. We all do.
I just wish I could see and hear you guys so much, but anyway, and look, your all cameras are off because that's all fine. Why would they be on? But anyway, I just, anyway, I really appreciate you guys being out there and listening. I don't know if we're ending now, if there was one more question, but.
There actually is one that just came in. Jet Tumor is wondering, why do you keep writing?
I know, like I said, I think it's like it's the agony of not, I think that, the afterword of my freedom book is very, there's a really beautiful book that came out last year by a writer I admire a lot named Denise Riley. She's a British poet and philosopher, and her book is called Time Lived, Without Its Flow. And she wrote this book after the death of her adult son in a kind of freak swimming accident when he was traveling in Spain. And I think I have that right, but after he died, she, as the title suggests, like, time lived without its flow, she found herself just out of time, unable to write. And so the question that she kind of asks in this book, Time Lived Without Its Flow, is, she says, it turns out you can't write without a sense of futurity, I learned. And then she says, even if you're not like a big narrative person, every emanation, she felt like needed to have some sense of, as she calls it, an and then and an after that. And she said, what to do when you're robbed of it. And so my afterword in the Freedom book was really about, what I think we're all feeling and what comes out of the climate crisis and things, which is, I think a lot of people feel a kind of, deep, even if nameless, emotional lack of faith in futurity. And here's where we kind of circle back to Morrison's point about the future of time. And I think that the idea of like, why write if there might not be a human audience in the future? You know, why write if you know, there's a lot of very interesting questions I think people are grappling with. But, you know, interesting to me is that those questions don't differ from any question anybody's ever asked themselves really about writing, because there's never been a guarantee of, you know, longevity or human audience or the futurity of the planet in any way, really. It's just that now we're in a particular moment where a lot of those questions feel more, you know, we're in a, people call, you know, scientists call global warming a, not just a wicked problem, but a super wicked problem, which actually has particular parameters that make something not just wicked, but super wicked. And one of the super wicked aspects is that the same people who are suffering it are the people who are causing it, you know? And I think that it's in partly that wickedness about the problem that makes us feel so much emotional pain. And both because we know we have both the capacity and we have the impotence in its face. And I think that that is maybe what makes some of the writing about futurity feel more, writing the feeling of futurity being foreclosed feel more emotionally difficult at present time. But, you know, I'm also a huge Beckett fan, you know, can't go on, must go on. I say it every day in COVID. I'm sure you guys do too. And so I leave you with that faith, you know, the Beckett type of faith.
Also fail and fail better.
Fail and fail better, absolutely. Yeah, why else write but to fail and fail better? So
Maggie, thank you so much. You're a gift.
thank you guys.
Really,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you. I think we're done here.
Okay. Thank you guys.
Clap, clap, millions of claps.
Yay. All right. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.